in plain English. So, Canada is the only country that grants the founding groups of Canada collective rights, making us unique from other countries. Having the Constitution and Charter prevents injustice, discrimination, and maintains order. It sets out guidelines for how Canada is governed and which groups of people inherit collective rights. It also prevents past failures in governing to reoccur in Canada. Every person living in Canada is given their own individual rights. We're all given fundamental freedoms like the freedom to practice any religion. We're given mobility rights like you have the right to move anywhere within Canada and earn money. We have equality rights like the right to be free of discrimination in any form. Legal rights like the right to be free of imprisonment, search, and seizure without reason backed by law and evidence. Lastly, we're given democratic rights, for example, the right to vote for any member of the House of Commons, but only Canadian citizens can vote. Canada's two official languages are French and English, making Canada a bilingual country. In Quebec in 1977, Bill 101 was passed by Quebec government and initially said that French could only be used on commercial signs, ads, etc. Also, everyone must go to Francophone schools, but it's now been changed and revised based on our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which came into place in 1982. So now, Bill 101 states that French and English had to be in commercials, ads, etc. But French has to stand out more. For educating your child, people living in Quebec must send their child to a Francophone school, but immigrants with children who've already received some education in English are allowed to go to an Anglophone school. If you are part of the minority language group living in either a dominant Francophone or Anglophone speaking province, then you as a group will receive rights based on the number of people. If you and many other Anglophones are living in Quebec, you have the right to publicly funded Anglophone schools. In 1763, Britain took control over Canada, and they needed to stabilize relationships with the First Nations who were already living there. The Royal Proclamation recognized First Nations' rights to land and established peaceful treaty-making. There were 11 treaties made between the Canadian government and the First Nations. Treaties 6, 7, and 8 were based in Alberta, and when signing the treaties, the Canadian government and the First Nations had two different perspectives on what would take place and the future consequences. The First Nations believed that the treaties would secure a good future for the next generations, and they didn't believe that the land could be owned by anyone. The First Nations accepted the treaties because they were promised to be given things like health care, hunting and fishing rights, reserves, farming assistance, annual payments, and education. First Nations leader known as Big Bear refused Treaty 6 many times because he was not satisfied with its terms, but he was finally forced to due to the quality of life of his people. Treaty number 7 made the First Nations children go to residential schools, where they'd be assimilated into European ways. The number treaties somewhat affirmed their First Nations collective rights as the founders of our country based on the benefits they were given. But at the same time it didn't, because the Canadian government really only wanted to assimilate the First Nations and remove them off the land for the railway. The Indian Act was legislation that stated who was a status Indian and who wasn't. The Act aimed to assimilate the First Nations into more European ways by the Canadian government deciding how they would sort out their own affairs, banning First Nation traditional ceremonies, and making them give up their legal identity if they wanted to vote. The foundation of the Indian Act was ethnocentrism. The Canadian government saw the First Nations people as people who needed guidance and themselves as superior. The Act reflected how the Canadian government understood the later treaties. The Métis were First Nation and European, but mostly French. They were seen as a distinct group and separate from the First Nations. The Métis thought they should be included in the number treaties. In 1869 to 1870, the Métis led the Red River Resistance, and the Métis set up a provisional government with Louis Riel as their president. In 1875, the Canadian government offered the Métis a script to either accept the land or become an Indian. In 1885, Louis Riel led the Northwest Resistance and resulted in military conflict with the Canadian government. The Métis were trying to protect their land as railway settlers moved westward. It ended with Louis Riel being hung for treason, and from 1938 to 1982, the Métis' quality of life was becoming better. They'd established settlements, and Canada provided them with land, and the Métis were included in Section 35 of the Constitution. That's it.